Welcome to Fresh Thinking by Snowden Optiro. My name is Susan Havlin. I'm the Managing Consultant for the Geology team here in Perth for Snowden Optiro. The topic of this podcast relates to identifying trends in our data for mineral resource estimation, what is wrong with trends, or right with trends, and what we can do about it. For this discussion, I am joined by Dr. Gregory Zhang, who is a Senior Consultant with us at Snowden Optiro. Greg has 14 years of resource estimation, exploration and academic experience across various commodities. He's experienced in both linear and non-linear estimation methods in resource estimation. He develops and presents Snowden Optiro's professional training courses in both English and Mandarin. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Susan. It's good to be here.
So, tell me, why does it matter if we have trends in data?
All right, so when we do the mineral resource estimation, it's very important to have the stationarity inside our estimation domain. So stationarity, that is numerical homogeneity, means we expect constant average and variance across the whole domain in every direction. But this is it's very common for us to encounter the trend in our domains, like grades increasing as we move eastward across the deposit. So ignoring these trends can bias our estimation and leading to inaccurate resource models.
Interesting. So let's talk about identifying trends in resource data. What are the common methods?
All right, so first we could do some directional plots, or it's called trend plots, where we can plot in grade values across different directions, like east-west, north-south, or increasing RL. So this can reveal the patterns of increase or decrease of the grades along certain direction, and that's trend. Also, earlier before we briefly mentioned the proportional effect in one of our tech tips. So that is basically when we use a moving window to calculate the average grade and the variance, we see the grade increase with the variance. So that's basically is proportional effect. And when we have the proportional effect, that means we don't have the stationarity, and also potentially there's a trend. But the second way is to do the variography, where we're calculating the variograms in different directions. And when we see the variogram keep increasing or never get stable, we know there's a trend. And the third is trend surface analysis. So this one is more useful for the 1D or 2D dataset. However, how it works is it will fit in a simple polynomial, like a linear or quadratic functions. So then we can identify and model those trends across spatial coordinates. And to isolate local grade variability, we can subtract the trend surface values at each point from the observed grade values. So that leaves the residues, which reflect the smaller scale local variation around the broad trend. So once we identify the trend, the next step is detrending. We have some practical ways to do that.
That's really interesting that you've explained how to identify these trends. Why are we so worried about these trends? Like, what's the implication for our estimation if we have these trends? Like, are we going to smear the grades, or are we going to misrepresent the grades in the block model?
Yes, that's very likely outcomes. And so when we have the trend, and if we don't take off the major trends, or using some quite relaxed search parameters that could smear the high grade into the low grade part, or vice versa, overall it will just cause inaccurate estimate when we do the validation, compare the estimated results with the input data.
So, I mean, could you think about it in that you could restrict your search? Would that be one way of mitigating the effect of the trend?
Exactly. And that's actually one of the practical ways we do when we try to use ordinary kriging to estimate into a domain with the trends. And also the other practical ways we do that is to subdomain, either explicitly or implicitly. As long as we can define this trend, we want to subdomain that trend from the rest. or we could use a categorical indicator kriging or MIK. So for those methods, we've already more or less covered in our previous podcasts. So today we are going to talk about something else. So two things. First is principal component analysis, and the second is universal kriging.
So can you break it down what principal component analysis and universal kriging actually is and how it helps with detrending?
Sure. So principal component analysis, or PCA, is a statistical tool that transforms the data into a new coordinate system. It identifies the main directions of variance, called principal components. So the first principal component represents the largest variance direction, which often corresponds to the primary trend in the resource data. So by isolating this component, we can remove the trend, leaving only the local variation. And let's say we have a gold deposit with a grade trend that generally increases from west to east. So if we use PCA, so the first step is we would need a matrix of center data, which means we will subtract the mean from each variable, including east, north, grade values, so that each variable has an average of 0. So next, we will calculate the covariance matrix. So the matrix will tell us how the variables, east, north, and grade vary with each other. So for instance, if grades increase consistently with eastward coordinates, we'll see a positive covariance between the east and grade. So the next now comes to the math-heavy part. So calculate the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of the covariance matrix. So the eigenvalues represents the amount of variance in each direction, and the eigenvectors gives us those directions. So the eigenvector with the highest eigenvalue is our first principal component, capturing the main trend in the data. And finally, we project our data onto this first principal component to isolate the trend. By subtracting this projection from the original data, we are left with residues, which represent the detrended data. So the mathematical details are way out of scope for this podcast, and so we're not going to discussing that here. But with the detrended data, we can perform more accurate kriging or other estimation techniques, so ensuring that our estimates are not biased by the large-scale trends.
Okay. Wow, Greg, that was a lot to take in. So for the people listening to this podcast, is this something that they can do themselves?
Actually, this is a bit like ordinary kriging. So for most of resource geologists who do ordinary kriging every day, probably I would say most of them don't know every bit of the mathematical details behind. But you can still run the ordinary kriging without any problem. So I guess this PCA is more like we were talking about ordinary kriging back in 1995. Mm-hmm. And back then, ordinary kriging is still a bit of like black magic. The good news is the principal component analysis, or PCA, is already included in quite some public library, where as long as you know a little bit of coding, you can already include that library into your workflow. Or you could just give us a call, and I'm more than happy to help.
I think I'll go with that option.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
So that's the PCA method. You talked about universal kriging. Do you want to expand on that one?
So we're not going to dive into all the details of universal kriging. In case there is nonlinear, very complicated variations in the trend, universal kriging can be really useful, because universal kriging that incorporates trend modeling directly into the kriging process. Instead of separating the trend and the residues as PCA does, universal kriging includes a deterministic trend component in the kriging equation. So this trend is typically modeled with polynomials, allowing universal kriging to handle non-constant means across space. Therefore, universal kriging can estimate both the trend and local variation in one go. However, universal kriging can be very, very sensitive to the parameters used to define polynomials. Therefore, it can easily get some very strange results.
Right. Well, that's quite interesting. So do you have a preferred method?
Okay.
I mean, it sounds like it's not going to be covered by just purely domaining. Like, these aren't like pure linear trends, are they? Because you're talking these methods more for the non-linear trends that we're seeing in data. Why would you use these methods over like the domaining or the CIK or the other methods you mentioned before?
Okay, that's a good question. So I guess there are two reasons from my perspective. First is sometimes when we have the trends not just in one direction, and especially most of the time under the mining context, we're dealing with the 3D data. So if the trend is more than one direction, it can be very hard to capture within one set of domain. And the second thing is with those highly powered computers nowadays available, I guess it is another way, just an alternative approach for us to think about whether we could use those methods and adapt those into our daily workflow, and just give us a different idea about how we could potentially do the daily work in a different way.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay. So now let's talk about some of the limitations of the methods you have just discussed.
I guess the first is high computation demand, because those methods you need to do a lot of calculations, and let's say go back 15 years before, it's probably not that appealing to us rather than nowadays. And especially universal kriging, it's computationally intensive. So for large data sets, this can require a large amount of time. And then for universal kriging, it requires us to specify the trend model using polynomial. So if we don't pick up the right trend model, the estimates can become inaccurate as well. Another point for universal kriging is that it handles trend and local variation in one go. So it makes it probably a little bit hard or challenging to interpret the results. And so when it comes to pick up which method to use, you will have to test different methods, use your data set, and also the availability in your software.
Well, thanks, Greg. That was a lot of information. And I think for me personally, I'm definitely going to come to you to find out a bit more about this subject. But thank you for coming on today's episode.
Thanks.
And that's it for today's episode on identifying trends and possible solutions for detrending in mineral resource estimation. So that draws this podcast to a close. Greg, thank you for joining us on Fresh Thinking and for participating in this discussion and identifying trends and possible solutions for detrending in mineral resource estimation.
Thanks for having me, Susan.
If you'd like to listen to more of our Fresh Thinking by Snowden Optiro podcasts, you will find them for free on our website, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and most other podcast platforms. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep you up to date with our technical podcasts.